Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to continue our lecture regarding scientific investigations and their relationship towards psychology. Previously, we have talked about other techniques that we may utilize within research. One of them was deception. Now, within deception, as you know, there are many ethical concerns when it comes to deception. However, one of the more important things about deception is that if we were to use deception within research, we have to ensure that that deception does not involve an inherent risk when it comes to that participant. Now, today we're going to cover other aspects of research, including animal research, right? So one of the important things about animal research is that generally it's not conducted frequently, okay? So I do want you to keep in mind, generally animal research is not conducted frequently. But why is it that we use animal research? Well, we have arguments, I should say, for and against animal research. One of the reasons why we do utilize animal research is because, first and foremost, we perhaps want to study behavior specifically about that species, specifically about that animal. So not necessarily one that is going to translate necessarily to human behavior, but sometimes we are indeed interested when it comes to that behavior specific to that animal. Now, another reason why we may want to conduct research with animals is because the general laws of behavior may apply to both of us. For example, humans and animals. We can see, for example, aspects of survival, right? How do animals react to survival? How do humans react to survival? That is because there are general laws of behavior that we can actually observe in both species. The next factor is that with animals, we can actually expose animals to specific treatments that would perhaps be unacceptable to humans. Generally, there are very specific guidelines as to how to conduct animal research that may, for example, involve a level of pain or surgical procedures. Now, in my other classes, the more advanced classes, we actually cover more in detail the requirements of covering and conducting animal research, and particularly geared towards aspects that could involve treatment or that could involve pain. Now, of course, there are a lot of aspects that we need to look into when it comes to the arguments against animal research. First and foremost, one of the ones that comes into mind, ones that a lot of individuals consider it morally wrong to inflict pain in order to conduct a scientific research. Another argument against animal research is that inherently we are violating the animal's rights, because the animal will be subjected to unnecessary cruelty. Now, this argument stems from the idea that animals have to be treated in a humane factor, just like humans would. So, for example, if you go to the hospital right now and you're in a lot of pain, part of your rights as a patient is to experience less pain, right? To the extent possible, right? That's why they provide palliative care, for instance, in a hospital. And the same idea translates into animals, right? The idea that they have to be treated humanely, specifically when it comes to pain, for example, or conditions that subject that animal to a high level of stress. One of the last arguments against animal research is that involves, well, sure, we can conduct research that can apply to both humans and animals, but ultimately that might not be the case. So the argument against it is that, sure, we can conduct this research, but ultimately it may not even apply to humans. That is one of the most relevant arguments against animal research. Are there any questions about that? Animal research in psychology. I will tell you, it is specifically rare. It's not conducted frequently. It is conducted, however, for the reasons that I mentioned before. So for example, we want to study the behavior within that species. We want to translate the laws that apply to animals and see how they translate into the aspect of human behavior. So it does occur. However, in order for that to occur, there are specific guidelines for both research with humans and research with animal subjects. And notice that I say subjects, I don't say participants, because an animal is subjected to research. They're not able to provide consent or participate like you and I. You and I can refuse or accept research voluntarily. So that's something to remember, because animals are subjected to research, therefore they are considered subjects, not participants. Now, how is it that we can conduct research with humans? Now, I will say this is an immensely succinct and brief overview of ethical principles, right? We have careers solely based on ethical standards, right? So this is simply just one slide to give you a brief overview. So I don't want you to think, oh, that's all I need to conduct research with animals and humans, right? There is a whole board that you need to go through, specific education and training, specific supervision. So there's many requirements before you become a scientific researcher with both humans and participants. One of the main characteristics when it comes to human participants is that your participation should be voluntary. It has to be voluntary. Not only that, you should have the ability, and you must have the ability, to withdraw at any time. And that applies for any sort of research you can ever think of. Mental health, engineering, whatever type of research you can think of, nursing, medical, that participant should know that their participation is voluntary and that they have the ability to withdraw at any time. So for instance, you should be able to know that your participation is voluntary. I have to let you know that information before you even decide to participate in a study. Right? So for example, towards the end of the semester, you guys are going to have the opportunity to rate yours truly, right? So like and subscribe, leave a nice comment in my evaluation at the end of the semester. That participation has to be voluntary. You cannot be coerced or persuaded into participating, right? You should also know that every time you participate, if you already provided consent, like, sure, sign me up, I want to participate in any sort of study, you should know that just because you agreed to a research, it doesn't mean you have to remain as a research participant. You can indeed withdraw at any point of the study. You don't have to remain there. And a lot of people do feel, well, I already made that commitment. Keep in mind, you can always withdraw. That is actually one of your rights as a participant. Any questions about withdrawal or voluntary participation? Something I like to add that's not here, which I find it very interesting, that they didn't mention that. Let's say, and actually you guys with Mr. Michael, our TA, you guys can be part of a research. That's one of the messages that he sent out, right? Let me ask you a question. If I were to say, every single one of you that participates in our research study, not mine, of course, I don't belong to that study, but the faculty study, every single one of you that participates gets an A in the class with lesson. Would that be considered voluntary? If I tell you guys, by show of hands, if I say, if you participate in the faculty study and I give you an A in the class, who thinks that's voluntary? Okay. Who thinks it's not voluntary, that it's a form of coercion? So about maybe a third of the class? You are correct. That will be considered a form of coercion. The reward is too great. The reward is too great for your participation, right? If I were to say you guys get extra credit, that's a little bit more reasonable. but to say, hey, you get an A, never show up to class, don't study, ooh, you got a free A in the class, right? That will be considered a form of coercion because the reward is too great. So is it really voluntary? Is it really that you want to participate? We actually covered that much more in detail in my research class, and it was interesting to see the different opinions in class. Now, another requirement when it comes to human research is that you should not be subjected to a harmful or a dangerous treatment. You should not be subjected to basically any sort of treatment that could potentially harm you or that could be dangerous. And of course, whenever you conduct research, we have to provide our research plan and our prospectus, if you will. We have to provide it to an ethical board, and they are the ones that determine whether or not your study is harmful. Right? So I'll give you an example. Say I have an individual who, and I think I've used this example before. Say I have an individual who has epileptic seizures, and I want to find out whether or not the amount of epileptic seizures relates to depression. So say this person has a formal diagnosis or has formal diagnoses for both epilepsy and depression. And I say, in this research study, you're going to be part of psychological treatment in which we are going to give you medication, or psychiatric treatment, I should say. And we're going to give you this medication in order to reduce the amount of seizures and therefore see whether or not it can help with your depression. But then it turns out I never gave that person that medication. They were part of the control groups. I never gave it to them. I gave them a sugar pill. How many of you think that that violates the second ethical standard of causing harm to this person? Okay, so we got about very low percentage, about 10% of the class. Notice that I am not causing harm to the individual. I'm not giving them seizures, right? So I'm not causing harm to the person. However, that is a form of deception. It's still a form of deception. So because it is a form of deception, I should say, that's where our next guideline would apply. If you have been indeed exposed to deception, which is I gave you a sugar pill instead of that medication that could or perhaps not help you with your seizures, I have to debrief you as soon as possible, whenever I am able, to let you know that there was deceit. So say, for example, in the case of this person, hey, I'm going to give you this pill. It's going to help you with your seizures and perhaps going to reduce your symptoms of depression. As soon as I'm able to tell this person, this pill was a sugar pill, I have to be able, first of all, to let them know. And second of all, reduce potential level of harms, for example, the stress. Man, I wasn't really part of this research. I thought I was going to get better. So I have to provide them with equal or equivalent treatment than that was subjected to the persons who were in the experimental trial. That's where we mitigate that risk factor of harm. And the last aspect is privacy. I have to ensure that your privacy as a participant is not compromised. So for example, your name, your last name, social security number, whatever, A number, student number, whatever means I can have to identify you, they actually have to be locked. It's a little bit more in detail, of course, but they have to be locked with 2 locks. So for example, a coded door plus a coded file cabinet or a locked file cabinet. So a double layer of security. I had to be able to encrypt absolutely everything if it was online. So there's many means, many legal requirements that I have to comply with in order to protect your privacy. Any questions about these specific guidelines of ethical principles when it comes to human participants? Fantastic. Privacy is immensely important, I have to say. A lot of people don't participate in research because they're immensely afraid of how is this person going to use my information, right? Are they just going to post it on TikTok? It's like, yo, check out how depressed this guy is, right? So of course that wouldn't be ethical. That wouldn't, not only that, I argue be illegal. Now we have some guidelines for animal research. Of course, there are many federal, state guidelines for animal research, but this is only a short summary of those statutes. The first aspect is if you are indeed going to conduct a harmful procedure with this animal, for example, a surgery, placing an electrode in their brain, conducting some sort of electroshock, the only way that this would be approved is that the potential benefits of research are substantial. What do I mean by that? I cannot say I'm going to have a lab rat, for example, and I'm going to open them up, conduct a surgical procedure, and place an electrode in their brain simply for funsies, right? There has to be a purpose for inflicting this type of pain in order for me to conduct this procedure. It has to be justified. For example, the research question would be a relationship between electrical currents and epilepsy in rats and how that can be translated into persons who have depression and epilepsy. That would be perhaps a justified means to conduct surgery on a rat. But it couldn't be just because I want to, or just because I can, because I'm faculty here, right? Because you guys, whoever decides to go later for their doctorate in psychology or biology, things of that nature, or neuropsychology, become a neuroscientist. Notice that it can't be just because you have that position of authority, but there is actually a purpose in order to conduct that surgery, for that surgery. One of the other factors that we have to ensure is not only during the investigation, during your research, but animals are indeed entitled to a dignified and decent living condition. This animal cannot be subjected to inhumane living conditions. They are supposed to have a clean space, a space in which they are entertained. Say, for example, they are a social species, right? We have chimpanzees, right, in our research lab, and we're trying to study the behavior of chimpanzees and translate that into human behavior, for example. This chimpanzee would have to be exposed to entertainment, be able to socialize, having food, water available to them, have a trainer, a person who is trained in order to provide those sorts of things to the animal, a clean environment. So notice that the ethical guidelines for animals don't only apply when we are conducting the research, but they also apply before, during, and after the research. Any questions about that? All right. I do cover this in much detail in my other course. So if you're interested in finding out more information, you are more than welcome. You're more than welcome to check those videos out. All right. There are no questions. Let's move on to the next section of our chapter, which is, we talked about all the different types of scientific investigations, right? But how exactly do we find out what happened after the publication, right? And that research, where was it published? And this is where we come across journals. What are journals? Any sort of journal that you can think of. Generally, it's going to come from a periodical, technical, scholarly material. It's generally immensely specific. It's very narrowly defined, an area of inquiry. So what does that mean, right? What does that mean? Well, a journal, it's simply think about a conglomerate of studies. So for example, if this is the Journal of Neuroscience, right, which is a field of psychology, it studies the relationship between the central nervous system and behavior, right? Which is, by the way, the best paying field in psychology. So wink, wink, right? You're interested. So if I have the Journal of Neuroscience, it's very narrow because now the articles and the research that's going to be published in that journal is going to be specifically geared towards neuroscience. Most journals are geared to showing original work, empirical research. So it wouldn't be secondary, right? So what's your first name, man? Okay. So let's suppose that Dr. Ogay over here publishes, she's a neuroscientist, and she implanted electrodes in baby chimpanzees and studied their development throughout their lifespan. She will be the one posting that specific research in that journal. Generally, it's not secondary. It wouldn't be from me talking about her, right, and her research, which you could include as a reference. Don't get me wrong, but generally it is an original research. Now, specifically geared in the field of psychology, PsycInfo is one of the more common databases that we utilize. So imagine this is Google, but like on science steroids, right? So PsycInfo becomes your Google, and it's only geared to finding journals as an online database. Any questions about what a journal is? Generally, journals are specifically geared towards scientific publishing, meaning they are peer review. Who can tell me what peer review is? Anybody? Once? Yes, sir.
Basically, just other researchers go over the study and potentially try to replicate it to make sure there isn't any flaws, such as not considering this major factor, not the study being flawed.
All right. What's your name, sir?
Daniel.
Daniel. So Dr. Daniel over here says that the means for peer review is people in your field, people who are also experts. So for example, her article about neuroscience and chimpanzees who had electrodes implanted when they were babies in their brain, and then she studied them for 10 years of her life. Somebody like Dr. Daniel, for example, would sit down with a team and first of all review her research and determine whether or not there are any flaws, whether it be with selecting the chimpanzees, where she conducted the study, the surgical procedure, was that flawed? The electrodes, the methods that she used to observe the chimpanzee, the methods that she used, for example, to record her information, right? The statistical procedures that she ran, that she used the correct statistical procedure and the statistical equations or formulas that she used the correct methods, and did she report that accurately? Best case scenario, there is a flaw, it was unintentional, and it's a small flaw that it can be corrected, right? So for example, Dr. Daniel and his team would put all of that together and say, if you do this, if you revise this, we will be able to publish. By the way, your research will be rejected 90% of the time, just letting you know. That's how difficult that process is. You think, wow, this research, I spent 10 years of my life doing this, and it got rejected. It will get rejected about 90% of the time, based on 23 submissions, by the way. It's different journals. I'm just letting you know. That's how it is in psychology. Okay. So afterwards, if the flaws are revised, the discussion is revised, then she will be able to be published. Now, generally, articles look roughly the same. Generally, they would have several sections, such as these. First one is an abstract, followed by introduction, method, results, discussion, and reference. And why do I say they all look the same? They all look the same because of standardization. I should be able to, for example, who here is in nursing? All right, what's your name? Sarah. So Dr. Sarah, let's suppose she publishes an article about patients who are dying, right? They're palliative care and they're schizophrenic, right? I should be able to read that research, even though I'm not in nursing, but I should be able to identify these aspects, right? And say, this is her abstract, so this is where I'm going to find Dr. Sarah's summary. And I should be able, someone who is knowledgeable enough should be able to get the general gist and idea of your research because these sections are the same. So notice that sometimes, for those of you who've done MLA, right, formatting, or APA format, or medical, which would be your case, right? American Medical Association. So they all have specific guidelines, but notice that it's with the intent of having basically a smooth reading of your article. Now, I do have other videos available that cover this in detail. So I'm going to give you a very short overview of what each section is. Very short overview. This applies to any of you, whether you're in engineering, in chemistry, if you are in nursing, any sort of applied science, any sort of hard science or soft science. The first section is the abstract. Anybody here knows what an abstract in a journal is? Yes, sir.
Basic summary / overview to sort of say like what the article is about and for what it does, so you can decide if you want to go in and read the whole thing.
Correct. It's actually a way, it's a very short summary in which we can see everything from that research. And I'm actually going to pull something out for you guys. All right. So let's say, trying to make this as large as possible. There we go. Okay. So an abstract, as you can see, it's a very short summary, right? It's a short summary that should include the variables, what variables, independent variable, mediating variables, moderating variables, dependent variables. It should include what the dependent variable was, how did I define the independent variable, how did I define the dependent variable. It also includes what methods that I utilized to gather that info. It also tells you the amount of participants that were part of that study. Where did they come from? And it should tell you a very brief summary. For example, in this case, controlling implies an experiment or quasi-experiment. So I already know that this is a quantitative research and that it was either quantitative, or I should say an experiment or quasi-experiment. And this was the result. This is actually one that I did. And it tells you what is it that I found. And most of them will include, why is this important? Why was this research important? Why was it working? In saying that, we also have the introduction. What is an introduction? An introduction includes a brief summary. It will include a summary of the background, for example. What led us to conduct this research? It will include the definition, the operational definition of those variables. And generally, it will include a rationale as to why you decided to conduct the research. Let's move on to method. what is the method in a journal? The method is that statistical procedure, or say, for example, if it wasn't a statistical procedure, how did you conduct that naturalistic observation? And that is the aspect that we like to replicate, right? You have to be very detailed, because if, what's your last name now? Nunez? So if Dr. Nunez over here, see, I speak Spanish. If Dr. Nunez over here publishes a research and Dr. Daniel wants to replicate it, that would be what he would follow, is the method section, because she will have to break down who are my participants, how did I define my participants, what did I do in order to collect and gather that sample from those participants, right? And if there was any statistical procedure, it would also include, say, for instance, what types of statistical procedures that you do during that time, and I'll give you an example. So in the research method, and I'm going to share my screen, so those of you who are watching online can see it better. So within the research method, you have to explain how did you gather that data, the participants, what is the dependent variable? In this case, it was the group's anxiety. In addition, it's going to tell you why exactly the person decided to have that research rationale. Why did we decide to go for a quasi-experimental approach in this case? Why do we have moderating or mediating variables? The research questions, which were they? Why do we have that rationale in order to determine those research questions? Define that population, so if somebody wanted to replicate it, they could. Where did you find your statistics? What type of a parameter did you decide to utilize? If it's statistical, where did I draw my sample in my sampling procedures? What type of power did you decide to utilize for that statistical procedure? Or in the case of a general, say for example, qualitative, what type of statistics that you use to measure for an effect size? And basically, how did you estimate that power analysis? And in this case, I did a analysis of variance. So that's what it looked like to calculate my power. So if someone were to grab my research, they should be able to replicate that study if they were to follow the methods step by step. And notice that it's immensely detailed, right? How did I gather that data for anxiety? This is the instrument that I decided to use. This is their relationship with the statistical relationship with other instruments that should measure the same thing. So that is validity. And it's moderately related to Beck anxiety inventory. It's a 0.51, so it's moderately related to the Hamilton anxiety scale. So notice that I have to break down all of the qualities of that instrument. How is it that I decided I was going to conduct the data analysis? For example, any software that I decided to use. And what were the research questions? And broken down. What were my hypotheses? So if you remember, H subscript 0 is no difference, no statistically significant difference. And H1 means alternate hypothesis. Any questions about the method section? Notice that you also mentioned threats and flaws that your potential research may have. And the actual validity of the terms that you utilize for your study. And it's always going to be there, your ethical procedures. What did I do in order to be ethical during my study? And here's your informed consent. We talked about that, about how your participation is voluntary. How did I inform my decision in order to make sure that I was abiding to ethical standards in my field? And if you're nursing, the ethical standards in your field or similar fields. And a summary of my methods. So notice that I was immensely detailed with the intent that someone else would be able to replicate. Now, with the results, I am not trying to explain anything. I'm just showing you what I found. I'm in the results section, and something to remember is I am not trying to explain anything. I am simply showing you what I found. So in this research, I'm going to share the screen over here. I was interested in looking into different religious makeup or irreligious makeup of individuals. So simply, I am telling you, simply describing what I found in my research. Notice that I'm not explaining anything. In my results section, I am only showing you what I found. So for example, I had 227 people who identified as female, 184, male 227, female 188, and 3 individuals who identified as non-binary. Majority of the individuals were white, and the second racial makeup was Hispanic, Latina, or Latino. So notice that I'm not explaining. I am simply showing you what I found in my research. So the vast majority of participants were not foreign, and 18% of my participants were indeed foreign. And these were the countries that were represented in my study. How many people came from each place, each country? So notice I did manage to do pretty good, zoom in a little bit. Right, so from the region of Asia, Middle East, Africa, Pacific, the Americas. So notice that I'm not telling you anything specific about this population. And if I had any caveats about that information. Now, if we keep going, the results are not showing you anything specific about my interpretation. They're simply showing you the statistical procedures that I conducted. What did I find out? Now, these are simply the statistics, so we're going to move forward. Anything that has an asterisk, you'll see that there was a relationship, or that was statistically significant. And that's something you will cover in your experimental classes. Now, let's move forward to our next section, which is our discussion. How is discussion different from methods? Well, discussions are different because in the results section, I am not interested and I am not showing you any interpretation of all that data that you saw. In the discussion, however, I will present you with an interpretation of my data. So I'll give you an example. In this study specifically, there was indeed a difference between the IB, which was religious discrimination, and level of clinical anxiety. So that's what this study sought to look into. And here we go. Interpretation of findings. So this study sought to see whether or not there was an impact between the religious discrimination that you may experience, whether because you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, whichever color of the rainbow, right? Whatever your flavor is, I wanted to look into it, right? Any sort of religious preference. Now, there was indeed a statistically significant difference. And in this study, I actually have to go into why is it that I consider that there was indeed a statistical difference. The most interesting aspect was that let's start with the first finding. Let's do that. In this study, I found that persons who were Muslim and identified as female reported the higher levels of discrimination, whether it be from their neighbors, peers, work. They experienced the highest discrimination, and you would think, well, therefore, they experienced a higher anxiety. There was a relationship there. But people who identified as agnostic experienced the more significantly clinical symptoms of anxiety. Basically, the symptoms that they reported were much higher. So overall, right, Muslim women had reported the higher level of discrimination in this study, but agnostic people did not report as much discrimination, but they did report the higher levels and more significant symptoms of anxiety in this study. Those are the results. In the discussion section, I have to provide you with an explanation as to why that is. And part of my explanation during this research was that persons who are generally agnostic don't usually have that sense of group and camaraderie that you may find, say, for example, in a church, in a temple, in a synagogue, right? So if I go to church, these are my people, right? So I have that sense of community. If I go to a temple, these are my people, right? So they have that sense of community. Whereas, where do agnostics go? Somebody told me agnostics go to a bar. That's what their sense of community. I don't condone that. Don't drink, kids. Don't do it. Don't do it. So in the discussion section, I actually had to present you with an explanation as to why the results showed up, how they showed up. Not only that, I also have to show you whether or not I think I was wrong, right? So for example, I was not expecting whatsoever that the agnostic group would report the higher levels, or I should say, the more clinical symptoms of anxiety. So I have to say that. That was a result that was not expected, and this is why. Any questions about the discussion section? Fantastic. And of course, the last thing would be your references. And that's simply every single piece of information you presented in your research. There's multiple reasons for including a reference. First and foremost, the list can allow other individuals to look into your sources and make sure that you were not fabricating any information and that you were using this information correctly, that you cited this person correctly. That's another reason. So any questions about an article in a journal? All right. If there are no questions, remember that there are other videos that do indeed cover this in much detail, covers each section, what to find in each section. So for those of you who do or will be exposed to research, whether it be in any of your fields, I highly recommend the video. I think it's titled How to Conduct a Literature Review or How to Read a Research Article. It's one of the two. Now we talked about The methods that we utilize, whether it be naturalistic observation in investigations in psychology, we talked about experimental research, quasi-experimental research. But there are other means in which you use to inform your decisions. What do you know, what you know? Well, first and foremost, a lot of people use anecdotal evidence. What is that? It's simply a story about a specific event. So, say for example, well, I have a friend that went to therapy and he hated it. Or I have a friend that went to therapy and absolutely loved it. I have a friend who dated this type of people and he had an awful time, right? Those are things you might have heard before. The problem in using this type of evidence, of using this type of information to inform your knowledge, is that it will lack that language that we use in research, right? Independent variable, dependent variable, alternating variable, right? It's going to lack that type of language. And if you recall from previous lectures, you'll remember that we talked about the shortcomings of self-reported data. What was an issue with self-reported data? Who can tell me what was one issue with self-reported data? Yes, sir.
Bias.
Bias. What's your name, sir?
Right.
Trey. So Dr. Trey says that in self-reported data, we have bias. Well, of course I have bias. I want to show you the prettiest side of myself, right? The same happens with anecdotal evidence. If I tell you, I went to a therapist and it was awful. She didn't know what she was doing. He didn't know anything about it. He knew nothing about nothing, right? And it makes me wonder, what did you do during your therapy session, right? Did you attend your therapy sessions? Did you do the homework that you were supposed to do during therapy? Were you open and honest about how you were feeling, right? So there is that same issue with that bias. The other problem is that it could be inaccurate. It could be embellished. It could be hearsay, right? Somebody tells you, oh, you know, Peter dated this lady and this lady was awful. What evidence do you have that she's awful? What Petey said, right? Well, we know that Petey has a vested interest because he doesn't want to sound like a big old jerk. So we know that it could just simply be hearsay. And of course, it can have sampling bias. You actually see that a lot with racism, actually, sampling bias. You actually do see that a lot. And what do I mean by that? Well, some people would base their whole experience with just one person, right? So for example, they interacted with a group of people that they haven't interacted with before, and then they base their opinion on that whole group of people with one person, right? I'm not gonna hang out with these type of people because I had a neighbor that was like that, and boy, they're all like that, right? Or they're never like that, or they always do this. What evidence do you have about that? Maybe that was that guy specifically, right? So it happens a lot with race, it happens a lot with religious preference too. It happens with a lot of methods. So then we do a sampling bias. We're only grabbing that sample that doesn't represent that greater population, right? It doesn't represent that big circle. It only represents a small sample. For all we know, the guy that you cannot get along with because of racial bias or religious bias, whatever the case may be, it might have been a him or her issue. It had nothing to do with the population that you believe they represent, right? So it does happen a lot with race. Any questions about that? Fantastic. All right. If there are no questions, that will be the end of this lecture.